you're looking at the mind as the conscious, like our awareness, and then our brain is like the kind of like the vehicle.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Any other explanations? Anybody else have an idea what the difference is between mind and brain and how we use them differently or interchangeably? No, don't be afraid to speak up.
So our mind, I think, would be process-wise more focused on the current stuff, and then the other one is you putting stuff on the back burner, depending on your responsibilities and your ordering of them.
Okay. All right. I see where you're going with that, kind of a philosophical explanation to it. And when in psychology, we look at the mind as similar to what you said, Jacob, as being the process, like our mental processing, where we experience feelings, we experience emotions, we have thoughts, those all mental representations, those all happen within the mind. Okay, so it's more of this etherical, philosophical existence that we call the mind. And then, of course, we have the brain, which I believe it was Bria had mentioned. This is more the vehicle. It's kind of the mechanical organism that processes things in bioelectrical impulses, and it's got blood flow, and it's got all these cells that work interchangeably to make things happen. So those are really the two differences. When we think of psychology, we look at the mind as being the more thought and feelings, and we look at the brain as being more of the biological, physiological structure that helps us do what we need to do. Okay, and today's lesson, we're going to be focusing more along that brain, the idea of the brain being a vehicle and how that looks. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with you so we can talk about some of these slides. Let's see here. All right, hopefully you can all see what I have on my screen here. So we're going to try and get through two parts of today's lesson, the neuron and the nervous system, and we're also going to get into the brain, if time allots, because these are really, in essence, the two physical structures, or the two topics that come up when we think of the physical structure of the brain. So our neuron and nervous system is kind of the wiring, and the brain is the collective of that wiring that keeps things together. Now, what I do want to caution you, you're gonna hear some theories, you're gonna see some things that are definitely gonna be a little bit more sciencey than when we get into emotions, or we get into development, or we get into some of these things that require more of that mind aspect stuff. But anything that you hear in psychology is based on theories. Okay. When we look at psychology, we look at it as a soft science. And that's not to say that it's not scientific. What we're saying is it's not always like physics, where 2 + 2 always equals 4, because that happens in more harder sciences like chemistry and physics and astronomy. I almost said astrology, which would not be a science. So anyway, we look at that as more of the hard science. Within psychology, we look at it as more of a softer science, because 2 + 2 doesn't always equal 4. We always have outliers. We always have people that either are on the bottom end of the norm or on the top end of the norm that don't quite fit within that normal spectrum. Okay, so when we look at psychology, we look at it in that perspective. So with that, we don't have a lot of proof within psychology. All right, for example, we don't have the ability to measure. We have ideas of how neurons work, but we don't have, for example, the way we do with electronics, where we can measure a circuit and see what the output is going to be every time. For example, memories. We have a general idea of where it's stored, how it's accessed, and how we react to that, but these are all based in theories and not similar sciences such as electronics. So keep that in mind as we go through here, because I'm going to be presenting a lot of theories, and some of them, some of these concepts that we're going to be exploring are going to have 2, 3, sometimes more theories associated with it. So that's just something for you to keep in mind. Within the neuroscience and the neuroscience side of psychology, not so much. We are able to pinpoint certain processes that occur, such as neurotransmitters and axons and electronic impulses, bioelectrical impulses and stuff like that. But how they correlate to the mind, that's kind of where we're still bridging the gap with science. Okay. So I'm not going to go through so let's do our warm up today. And if you could just let me know true or false, or thumbs up, thumbs down. Neural impulses travel through the human body at the same speed that electricity travels. What do you think?
True.
I think that's true. Okay.
Yeah,
True. I think it's false.
Okay. For those of you that think it's false, why?
Well, isn't it faster, technically?
Neural impulses or electricity? Which one's faster?
Oh, neural impulses.
Okay. Okay. They have a shorter distance to go than say from a power station to a house, but we do know that electricity travels near or at the speed of light. Okay, which neural impulses, they're not necessarily light or electricity. They do have an electrical component. They have an actual action potential associated with them, but they are biochemical reactions, which means that they are significantly slower than light. So that is actually false for that one. And when we think about that, like the difference between computers and humans, right? Like if we have to hit a button on our computer, that happens pretty quickly, right? If I type a command into my computer and it brings up a website, there's not a whole lot of thinking unless you have a slower computer or an older computer that takes a little bit of time for it to process that information and bring it up. Almost all of those electrons are flowing near or at the speed of light. When you think about processes within the humans, for example, we'll take driving. You're driving down the highway and you see something jump out in front of you, or you see the brake lights come on in the tractor trailer driving ahead of you. Does that reaction happen immediately?
Yeah.
No. It might seem immediate to us. It might seem like it's pretty quick for us, but in all actuality, there are many things that happen, and it takes us almost a couple of seconds for us to process that and respond appropriately. So it doesn't happen instantaneously. We have a mental process that occurs, and it's not at the speed of light. It is significantly slower. But if we had a computer that was able to detect as soon as those lights came on and then stop that car, that process would happen much, much, much quicker. We're talking probably fractions of a second for that reaction, where it takes us roughly about 3 to 5, sometimes longer seconds to react to that. Okay. And this one might be from your reading. Endorphins are neurotransmitter molecules similar to morphine.
True.
Okay. True. Got a true. Let's see a couple other trues. Any other false? Okay, true. Okay, when we get into endorphins, we'll talk about what they do and the functions that they serve, but they are indeed neurotransmitters. It's contained within us, and some of them act to suppress or eliminate pain, which is similar to what morphine does for us. Okay, next question. For you to be able to run, your central nervous system must talk to your leg muscles. What do you think, true or false?
True.
True.
Okay.
True.
And the operative word being in there, yeah, true. Let's see, I don't see anybody thumbs down or anything. So the operative word being in there, talk. Okay, it's in parentheses. Now they're not necessarily using words, but again, they're using those bioelectrical impulses to get information down to our legs, and then like through interneurons, kind of the superhighway of our nervous system. But we have a couple things happen. We got to be able to regulate how far we're moving our legs through biofeedback, and then of course process that information and then make adjustments appropriately within our motor cortex, okay, which we'll also talk about. All right, the simplest neural pathways are those that govern our sexual desires or drives, I'm sorry. Okay, seeing true or a lot of check marks. What do you think? Simplest neural pathways are those that govern our sexual drives. Oh, I hit the answer on that. So the answer is false on that one. There are many other pathways, especially with fear. And we'll get into that when we get into the autonomic nervous system as to why that exists. Okay. Sex drives is a strong motivator for many of us to behave and act and think certain ways, but it is not the simplest form. Okay. We'll go into what the simplest ones are. And knee-jerk reflexes requires the activity of the central nervous system. What do you think? We're looking at reflexes here. Okay, a lot of truths there. That one is also true, which we'll also cover. All right. So biological psychology, as the slide says here, is the scientific study of links between the biological and psychological processes. Now, that's very important to understand. Again, looking at the brain as an organism, as an organ that is functioning in a way that it drives thoughts, that it drives emotions, that it drives behaviors, that it drives expressions and words and so on and so forth, and preferences, you name it. So again, trying to bridge that gap sometimes is very, very difficult. Sometimes it's very obvious, especially if a certain area of the brain has been damaged, or if we had separation of the spine or something like that, that might affect bodily functions. Those are clear cases of where we can see some hindrance of the biological process affecting the psychological process. But other ones are not so easy, like memory or in some cases even reflexes, but we'll get into some of those examples here in a little bit. There are many kinds of biological psychologists. This is a great field if any of you are thinking of bridging the gap between nursing and psychology. Neuropsychology is probably it is a very robust field and very much needed, but we'll see behavioral neuroscientists who look at the lack of functioning. Maybe there might be some kind of damage in the brain that somebody isn't able to learn. That occurs quite frequently, especially with apaxia and aphasia and several other disorders, which we'll get into. But neuropsychologists, they deal with more of the cognitive functioning. So if somebody is experiencing a loss of intelligence, or they're experiencing memory loss and they can't explain why, they might go to a neuropsychologist to look at more of those mental functions not occurring due to biological reasons. It could be Alzheimer's or dementia or some kind of toxins in the brain or something else. Behavior geneticists, okay, if somebody is predisposed to outbursts or something like that, that's not necessarily explained by environmental reasons, we might turn to a behavior geneticist. Physiological psychologists, looking more at the cognitive side of things, and then biopsychologists, again, getting more even finer tuned into neuronal pathways. Okay, so there are many other facets that these professions get into, but keep in mind that they are very closely tied with the medical field and medical explanations for that. Okay. All right. So breaking things down to its basic component, we're going to look at the neuron. Now, the neuron is the smallest entity within the smallest, not entity, the smallest form of reaction that we can have in our brains. Okay, and we're born with many of these neurons, these cells that eventually turn into something. They serve a function, and then either they're used or they're not used. It's estimated that we're born with nearly 200 billion neurons. Okay. And then by the end of our lifespan, we're usually wound up with only about 20 of those neurons. Okay. But we're going to break those down and show you just how a neuron works and how it connects and creates what we call a biochemical impulse. But so looking at the cell body, if you can see this orangish area here, this kind of round area that has all these branches coming out of it, right there in the center, that's called the cell body or the soma. And that contains a nucleus with chromosomes. Now, those chromosomes are the instructions that tell the cell body exactly what its function is, how it's supposed to grow, how it's supposed to interconnect with other cell bodies. And depending on how that cell is developed, it either does what it's told, or again, it dies off and goes away if it's never used. But that's the function of that soma, is just basically contain those chromosomes and tell that neuron how to grow and what function it serves. Okay. And then on the outside, if you see those branches that come out of the soma and the cell body, you'll see dendrites. Now, these dendrites are branches that connect to other terminal branches of the neuron, which I'll talk about in just a minute, but they receive information from other neurons. So if you can see, like, each one of those points are probably connected to another neuron somewhere else floating around in our gray matter or throughout our body. But they connect through that and receive the information, and then at that cell body, it's going to determine what it needs to do. Okay. And I do have some great videos on how this process works, some great animations. I'm not going to play them here just for the amount of time that we got to get through everything and explanations. But the next part that we have here is the axon, which transmits information to other neurons. So as you can see, the information comes in through the dendrites, goes in through the soma or the cell body, determines whether or not it's going to fire or not fire. But if it fires, it will send a signal down the axon to the other neurons where it's connected, as you can see off to the right here with this picture. Okay. Within each terminal branch connecting the cell body. So if you can imagine, like in the previous slide here, where you have this cell body to the right, this neuron to the right, connecting with the neuron to the left. In between those, we have synapses. And those synapses are just little spaces that exist between those terminal branches and the dendrites. Okay. And there's a reason for that. They're not hardwired. They don't form because, first of all, they're not designed that way. Cells don't just grow together. They have certain bonds that they have to, certain rules that they have to abide by, and within those bonds are spaces. Okay. Neurotransmitters exist within these synapses, and they serve functions. They do certain things and tell that next neuron what it is and is not to do. Okay, and we'll talk about neurotransmitters, get a little bit more in depth with that in a few minutes here. But they play a fundamental role in the communication between neurons. And when we get into drug use and psychopharmacology, that plays an even bigger role, because what we're doing is we're altering those neurotransmitters so that they either fire or don't fire, or that they're not absorbed or reabsorbed differently across those synapses. But anything drug related, most things drug related, happens within these synapses. So just be aware of that as we move forward, and we do talk about drug addiction and how that plays out, because that's where those areas are implicated in that. Also important here, another term that we'll throw at you is Melon. So Melon Sheath is a protective insulation that helps to protect that neuronal impulse. So it keeps it from interference. It helps it to communicate a little bit more effectively. It protects loss of signal. So it's basically just a coating that goes over the axon to help it process a little bit more effectively. Now, thinking in electrical terms, if you had two electrical wires that didn't have any kind of coating on them whatsoever, didn't have any insulation, what is the danger with that? What could happen if you have two exposed wires?
Could cause like fires and stuff like that.
Right. You would have an interruption of signal, you would have short circuiting, you would have all these unwanted effects of things that would happen within that's supposed to happen. That wire wouldn't happen because it's not protected. And that's really all the Melon sheath is designed to do, is to protect that axon from any kind of interference or any kind of signal loss so that it can operate more effectively. And that's going to be very important, especially in vital functions such as our heart rate and temperature and digestive tracts and all these things that are important for survival are usually protected by Melon sheath. Occasionally we'll see gaps, or we'll see things that that sheath is not covering, and what we tend to see is some kind of dysfunction that could occur, and certain disorders that might come about because of that. Okay, so within the neurons, we have three types of them. We have sensory neurons, we have inner neurons, and then we have motor neurons. Sensory neurons, as you can see in this picture here, are different types of receptors that pick up heat. They pick up ruptures in the skin. They pick up pressure. They might pick up, trying to think what some of the other ones are, but they detect whatever it is around us. Like if you had put a pin at the end of your finger, you would probably feel that, because we have a lot of these sensory neurons, these sensory receptors at the end of our fingers. So these neurons pick up the signals from those sensors and send that signal to our brain through inner neurons. Okay, so these inner neurons connect with our brain processes, and it helps us determine what our action is going to be. Now, within reflexes, it happens pretty quick. And this is another explanation as to why Melon sheath is important, because we have to, this is a basic survival function here. What would happen is if there was a breakdown in that sensory neuron or that motor neuron that would prevent that reflex, what would happen to the individual? If we didn't have that reflex, if there was something broken down in one of these types of neurons, like
they like wouldn't feel the pain, so therefore they wouldn't move their hand away.
right, yeah, exactly. So a person that lacks this type of reaction would likely be subject to all sorts of dangers in the world, and it could affect them to the point where, you know, they're either burning their finger or getting jabbed with something and bleeding out because they're not aware of the pain that's occurring, or they're not reacting to it. So that's why those are very, very important and require special attention, is because we got to make sure we're able to sense things, and we got to make sure that they're connecting through those inner neurons. And we also have to make sure that we're able to act in a reflexive way towards that danger, that threat. Okay. So within the cell body, we have what's called an action potential. Now, the action potential is the ability. It's kind of like if you know anything about electrons or electronics, we know that everything has voltage. This is kind of the voltage within the body cell, within the neuron. So each body has a charge that's ready to be fired if it's activated to doing so. And that once that action potential is released, it heads down to through that axon to the next cell body. And that cell body is going to determine what it's going to do with that. It could either hold on to that and wait for other signals, or it could go ahead and fire off and continue that signal. Sometimes that happens, and again, it just depends on what that cell body is designed to do. If it's designed, for example, say the second one on the right, is the receiving neuron, if that's designed to accept no more, no less than 5 signals from other neurons, then it won't fire. Okay, so let's say that on the left here, we have 5 different cell bodies that are capable of sending signals. Okay, and we'll say this one on the right here requires 5 signals from cell bodies. Okay, but it only gets 4. So these ones on 4 of the ones on the left would be sending an action potential to this cell body on the right, but the cell body on the right doesn't necessarily fire because it has not met its threshold. That could happen. Okay, but the other ones are doing its job. All right. So the action potential is an electrical charge gathered by dendrites in the cell body. Okay, and that just travels down that axon to the synapse, across the synapse, and activates the other cell body. Okay. It only occurs when an electrical signal is at a certain threshold, which I think I have a diagram here for the next one. Okay. Where we go? No. Okay. I'll get to it. I think I have a slide that shows that. Okay. So when we're looking at action potential, what we're seeing here is a threshold. At this neuron, it's looking at -70, okay, in millivolts. So that's what it's expecting to see throughout. Okay, so that's a resting potential. So when something activates that cell body, it's going to hit the stimulus threshold. Okay, once it hits like that -60 millivolts, it's going to fire. It's going to fire everything that it has. And you'll see a positive, go into the positive millivolts, and it'll send that signal, and then it refracts. It's just a pulse. It's just a blip. And then once it fires, it bounces back into resting potential. It is all or nothing, which means there's no, if it's designed to fire off positive 30 millivolts, that's what it's going to do every time. So why is it that we can feel different thresholds of pain? Well, let's use pain as an example. So why, if it's all or nothing for firing of this threshold, this action potential, then why is it that we might feel different levels of pain or sensations? What do you think?
I think we're gonna feel different because the stimulus depending of the level of the stimulus is gonna be the reaction of the action potential.
Okay. So let's use an example based on what you said. We saw the example of a person putting their finger over a candle. So as they move closer to that candle, say we put it just maybe 6 inches above the candle, and we feel a little bit of heat. Okay. That action potential is firing full force. Okay. So we're feeling it. Now our brain has been trained to understand that there's a difference between a little bit of heat and a lot of heat. So as we put our finger closer to that candle, more pain receptors are going to be activated, which means more of our sensory neurons are going to be firing. All right, which is telling our brain what?
Too hot.
That there's danger, right? That there's something that's damaging our body, and we need to move away from that at an alarming rate. So, which is what our reflex is. So our brain has been trained to detect not necessarily the threshold, not necessarily the peak of these, because these peaks are going to be the same through each cell body. But the more sensory neurons that are firing, the more our brain is telling us that something big is occurring that we need to react to. Okay, so that's just really the example that I have for action potentials. I always like to use the analogy of a toilet flushing. Okay, there's when you flush a toilet, you're not really putting a little bit of water down, right? That once that water builds to a certain level, it releases through the drain and it just takes everything out, right? And then refills and then does it again. Okay, and that's kind of what the all or nothing idea is with these action potentials. Is there's no half measures with it. It's all or nothing. You flush, it fills up to that threshold and then releases. It drops all that all the water and its contents out of that toilet. Okay. The two types of neurons within the nervous system that we have are excitatory messages and inhibitory messages. And all you really got to know for these is ones that fire and ones that inhibit. Okay. So for example, if we have a neuron that fires and wants to send a message that the brain needs, then it's going to get that message there by any means possible, and it's going to keep firing until that message is received. With inhibitory, the inhibitory neurons, what we would see as an example, if a cell body is firing and it needs to, like for hunger, for example, if we get hungry, what happens? We start to feel sensations through our body, right? We have a threshold. We have things that are telling us, hey, we need to go seeking food. So what happens with inhibitory messages is once we're satiated, once our GABA neurons, our GABA neurotransmitter is satiated and we're no longer feeling that, your GABA will fire, which says we're full, we're good. But your inhibitory messages will say we don't need to seek food anymore. So that's the function of inhibitory messages. Even though there's messages being sent excitatorily, the inhibitory messages will keep us from continuing to seek food when everything else is happy, everything else is good. Okay, so that's really the only difference between excitatory and inhibitory messages. All right, the anatomy of the synapse. I'm just going to kind of briefly go through this again, just to kind of help you understand what this looks like. So if you look at the right hand side of your screen here, you see this is where the terminal buttons of the axon connect with the dendrites. Okay, so this is the connection, and within that connection, as you can see, there's this space where you see the little green dots, which are your neurotransmitters. But they're released across that synapse, and they're either accepted, rejected, or dissolved within that synapse to either send the message or something confuses that message, such as drugs or psychotropic medications. So the little bubbles you see in here, these are these are vesicles in here that that contain the synaptic vesicles, sorry, that contain the neurotransmitters. And once that action potential comes across, there's a chemical reaction that kicks these bubbles, these vesicles across and release neurotransmitters. Okay, and once these neurotransmitters are released, that's when the signal is passed through. Okay. All right. So yeah, I'm not going to really go through any of these. Neurotransmitters bind to specific receptors in a lock and key kind of way. So if there's a receptor that's not designed for a certain neurotransmitter, in other words, neurotransmitters can only go to receptors that accept them. If there are different neurotransmitters, like such as dopamine, if there's a dopamine receptor, serotonin will not be able to activate that receptor. And again, each one of these receptors tell the cell body what's going on and what we need to do next. Okay. Synaptic transmission. Let's see here. Oh, okay.
Most neural communication begins with the release of.
I'm just gonna pause that. So this gives you a demonstration of how these synaptic transmissions happen. So say we have a buildup. If you're looking at this video, these vesicles are transmitting to the surface, and they're pushing these neurotransmitters across to whatever appropriate receptors that they need to go through. Okay, and this happens in fractions of a second over thousands of times throughout your body. So as you can see, with all these processes, it's not just like an electrical signal. It's there's a very complex process that is involved in this. Okay. All right. So that's how transmissions occur. So what happens to neurotransmitters in the synapse?
If left undisturbed.
So what we'll see here is once these neurotransmitters go to the receptor sites and transmit their messages, they have to do something, because otherwise those neurotransmitters will not be able to retransmit. So they go through what's called a reuptake process, which means they go back home. Once everything levels out and we have that refractory stage where the action potential is recoiling. So all of these neurotransmitters try to head back home. They try to head back to their synapse where they the axon where they came from. Okay, this is known as reuptake. There are also enzymes, so they can only exist. These neurotransmitters can only exist in that synapse for a period of time. So if reuptake does not occur, then they go through a dissolving process, and these enzymes will break these neurotransmitters down, and they're lost for good until that axon has to reproduce them. Now that's important to understand, especially when we're looking at certain medications, because certain like psychotropic medications are designed to work with these neurotransmitters. So if they're constantly just making neurotransmitters because reuptake is inhibited, then that could be problematic. That means somebody might be becoming dependent on that medication. So until that process starts happening automatically and naturally like it was before, we're going to experience a period of dependency on that medication or that substance, okay, which is what we see quite often through chemical dependency and addiction. Okay. All right, so as I kind of demonstrated, what happens to neurotransmitters in the synapse. We have reuptake, which it's absorbed back into the axon. We have enzyme deactivation, where it's broken down by enzymes. We have autoreceptors, where the neurotransmitters bind to autoreceptors in the site. And then we have neurotransmitters passively, they might just drift off to the side and eventually be broken down or reabsorbed by other synapses. All right, let's see. I'm going to play the Parkinson's disease because this will kind of depict on what happens, how neurotransmitters are can affect an individual. Actually, I think I have to. Let's see, apologize. Pause share. New share. Share sound, there we go. Oops.
People like Del Maxon, who, when we first met him, seemed beyond hope.
It's like having a sharp mind that's it's in a body that doesn't work.
Del Maxon is 55 years old. He lives in Forestville, New York, near Buffalo. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's 14 years ago, and the disease has gotten progressively worse. The muscles freeze, immobilizing him. Drugs relieve that condition for short periods, but produce uncontrollable wild movement. It's a cruel choice between the effects of the disease and the effects of the medicine.
My days revolve around my ability to move. I can't plan ahead for anything, so I just wait until I'm able to move to do something.
Up until 3 years ago, he was able to cope with the disease. But the Parkinson's swiftly took over his body and the medication ceased to work.
Can hardly do anything.
For more and more of every day, he was barely able to function.
That's about the extent of it for a while.
The wild movements called dyskinesia made him housebound, totally dependent on his wife, Barbara.
We don't go out to eat. He used to like to go bowling. He can't do that. Just very limited. There's nothing really we can do.
He could not bear to suffer the stares of strangers.
They look at you like you're mentally handicapped, feeling sorry for you, and that's another thing. I really don't want anybody feeling sorry for me. I want to be treated the same as other people.
For the first time in years, Del Maxon is back playing his favorite game. Any way you could have done this, say, a month ago? Or
I couldn't even pick up the stick a month ago.
just take me through some of how your life has changed.
How my life has changed. Today, I got up, I shaved with a razor, and I put in my own shirt.
These are major things, though, for you, correct?
These are absolutely major things. Just everyday things that other people take for granted.
All of which seem like breakthroughs for you.
Yes. Here we go, you handsome dog, you.
On a recent Sunday morning, Del got himself ready for an even bigger breakthrough. He'd stopped attending his church almost 3 years ago, too embarrassed to be seen. But on this day, he was in control of his own body and finally ready to be welcomed back to the congregation. You went back to church for the first time.
Yes.
Was that a big moment in your life?
Major. Just to be out in public and just to do something as simple as that, just to go out and be amongst people and not feel like I have leprosy or something.
What'd your friends make of it, being in church after all these years?
They were thrilled. They were thrilled.
I am so glad to see you. It's been such a long time.
Like a new man.
It strikes me that you are a new person. Do you feel like a
Absolutely.
new
I've got a new life. My perspective before the operation was Parkinson's is incurable and progressive, which means it always gets worse. It never ever gets better. So it was kind of a dark future that I had. Now I've got a future.
All right. What did y'all think about the video?
The beginning was devastating. That's so sad that a lot of people have to live like that. And I feel like he was young for it to be so bad. I think I've heard of people having it that bad and they're older. I don't know. I could be wrong though.
Yeah. It hits various ages. Usually later in life, there have been cases where people have been diagnosed with Parkinson's, early 30s and sometimes late 20s. We do see it show up later in life, but it's definitely one that we would consider a progressive disease. Does anybody know anybody that's ever had Parkinson's that cares to share their experience?
He's not my friend, but I do know someone who has Parkinson's.
Okay. What was there? I mean, was it advanced or was it still like mild symptoms?
I'm not sure, but like when he's like a YouTuber or something, he's a content creator. So he plays a game called Valorant. So when he's shooting, it's a shooter game. So when he's shooting, he likes move his mouse like really aggressive through the left and to the right, like, but it's only when he does that action. I don't know why it works like that, but
Okay.
probably it's
Yeah.
not like real advanced.
Yeah, and that what we have implicated, we've implicated low or falling levels of dopamine to be the reason for that happen for these dyskinesia to occur. So people that have dyskinesia are they're unable to manage their motor movements very well, and that's why we see the flailing. That's why we see the shaking, is because their fine motor skills are gone, and that might be a symptom of that. I've heard of that, where people might be moving their mouths or moving their heads because it's connected. You know, we talked about the necessary of protecting those signals. When those signals are not protected, especially in the dopamine neurotransmitters, then we are going to see misfiring. We're going to see fine motor skills being inhibited or being aggravated. And see movements that they don't want, which is what we see in Parkinson's. So very sad disease, currently uncurable. There are ways to slow the progression and even reduce those the dyskinesia that we saw him having. But eventually, what would happen is they would keep upping the dosage on that individual until those symptoms go away, until it gets to the point where they reach toxicity with that medication. So at that point of toxicity, they have to stop taking that medication because it's no longer effective and it's no longer helping them with their symptoms. And then they would have to try something new. So it's a very progressive disease and very scary one for somebody that's going through it. So what I'd like to go through now is our types of transmitters. And your book does a pretty good job at giving you examples and descriptions. I'm just going to kind of brush through them and give you their functions and what happens when they're malfunctioned. So acetylcholine is our ACH, which is known as, enables muscle actions, learning, and memory. So anytime that you have to make some kind of action, you have an idea that you want to move your arm or something like that, ACH is heavily implicated in that function. And people with malfunctions in acetylcholine might have, as shown here, if the function is learning and memory, we're going to see issues with Alzheimer's, okay? Now, Alzheimer's disease is there's a lot that goes into it, but just because of misregulation of ACH does not necessarily mean that they're going to get full-blown Alzheimer's, but we're going to see memory issues. We're going to see learning issues if ACH is not, or if it's inhibited or if it's affected in any way. With dopamine, similar to what we saw with Parkinson's, influences movement, learning, attention, and emotion. We also know that dopamine is what's called our pleasure neurotransmitter, our pleasure chemical in our brain. So anything that rewards us, anything that we feel that we've done good, or even in eating, like if we eat something that is pleasurable for us, that shows up in dopamine. Our dopamine kicks in high gear and rewards us for whatever we just did, which we see a lot in addiction as well. People that overstimulate their dopamine through cocaine or through cigarettes or through coffee expect to have that high, expect to have that reward all the time. So dopamine is implicated in a lot of addictions as well, including eating disorders too. If somebody's rewarded for stress eating, dopamine is also responsible for that. But it influences movement, learning, attention, and emotion. And high levels are linked to schizophrenia and low levels are linked to Parkinson's. Okay, so somebody with overactive dopamine is probably going to have symptoms like hallucinations, and either auditory or visual hallucinations associated with schizophrenia. Okay. Oops, where's my, okay, serotonin. Serotonin is known as our mood regulator. It affects our mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. You probably heard of serotonin as it relates to depression, right? So somebody with lower levels or misregulated levels of serotonin we're going to see them probably crash in what looks like depressive symptoms. Also, misregulation of serotonin we might also see with bipolar disorder. So somebody that has ups and downs will have high levels of serotonin, and probably dopamine is implicated in bipolar as well. But those will fluctuate to give that person those highs and lows periodically. Norepinephrine helps to control alertness and arousal, and malfunctions of that, especially in low levels, we'll see depressed mood. Okay, so this is kind of our awakeness. So somebody with lower norepinephrine, they're going to show lower energy. They're probably going to be sorry, I'm gonna lost my train of thought here. They're going to seem lower energy, like they're not functioning. They're not going to be able to get out of bed, probably not be able to put together a thought like I just had. And then our last one we're going to discuss are endorphins. And we talked about in the beginning how endorphins, they boost our mood and they lessen our pain. Endorphins, especially when we experience like a flight of something happening during fight or flight, our endorphins kick in because it gives us that boost. It gives us that energy that we need to muscle through whatever we need to do to either fight off that fear, fight off that threat, or move away from it as quickly as possible. In addition to helping it, giving us that boost, what do you think the purpose of lessening pain is? Why would endorphins be important in lessening pain in serious situations?
Adrenaline?
Yeah, adrenaline. What does adrenaline do? Why do we need to lessen pain in serious situations? What happens if we're injured while we're trying to flee from a danger? Do we want that?
It helps you to, I guess, think more clearly.
Right. What it helps us do is it gets away. It's like a morphine at that point. It takes away whatever pain. Our body is designed to take away its own pain in heightened functioning and in periods of heightened arousal, because we need to do what we need. Our priorities are to either get out of danger or ward off danger or do something that we're biologically needing to do in order to that to be our focus. So that's all endorphins do is help us to reduce that pain so we can get out of danger. So can you imagine if you stubbed your toe while you're running away from a bear? What happens if you're going to focus on your toe? Probably going to get eaten by the bear, right? So that's the purpose of endorphins, and that's why we have them, is to help us with that. With these neurotransmitters, I just want to point out that there are over 40 transmitters in the body, and we only covered, what was that, 6, I believe, right? I think it was only 5. Now there's GABA, there's histamine, there's oxytocin, there's I mean, there's just too many for us to really go through. But these are the 5 bigger ones that we're probably going to deal with the most in psychology. All right. Let's see, do we have time here? Yeah. So within the nervous system, we're going to start breaking down the nervous system here. Within the nervous system, we have 2 branches that come off of what we call the nervous system. We have the central nervous system, which is the CNS, and we have the peripheral nervous system. Now, the peripheral nervous system is responsible for autonomic actions. So there are 2 sides. The peripheral deals with basically the physical side of your reactions. Okay, so we have our autonomic, which is your internal glands, your heart rate, things that we don't necessarily have control over, your breathing. So when you're sleeping at night, or if you're knocked unconscious, these things tend to happen without you thinking about them, and they need to, because if you have to focus your energy on doing these things, then that doesn't leave much energy for focusing on newer threats in your environment. So, or if you forget to breathe, that could be fatal for somebody. So that's why those things are considered autonomic or ANS. Within the somatic side, these are more purposeful. These are where we're moving our skeletal our skeletal muscles. So if we need to move our arms to pick up a glass of water or something, we can do that, but that takes purposeful thinking in order for that to happen. Okay. Within the CNS, the central nervous system, the other side of it, we have our brain, our spinal cord, and these are composed of our inner neurons. Okay, so these are just basically kind of the highway system. The inner neurons are the highway system that connect your entire body with your sensory motor, with sensations and pain receptors and such. Within the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, we have two paths. We have the sympathetic nervous system, we have the parasympathetic nervous system. So those two are implicated. Those two are very, very important. You're going to hear me talk about that when we get into fear responses. We're going to talk about it when we get into fight or flight or anger, where the parasympathetic and nervous. Let's see if it shows. Yeah. Okay. So the sympathetic, if you can see off to the right here, this diagram, the sympathetic nervous system helps with arousal. So if, say, we're walking in the woods and we encounter a bear in our path. How many of you have ever encountered something like that? You encountered a ferocious animal out while you're walking, minding your own business. What happens? What happens within your body physiologically?
You're scared?
You get scared. So what kind of things tell us that our body is getting scared? What happens within our body? What happens to heart rate and muscle and breathing?
We start breathing hard.
Yeah. So our heart rate goes up, our breathing probably, and it depends. Some people might breathe heavily. Most people don't breathe at all. They stop breathing when they have fear. Why do you think that is? What is the function of stopping breathing while we're scared?
Probably to let the animal think that we're not there, probably.
It could be that might be a function. Another one might be that we are trying to listen. So if we're creating noise, we might be trying to also hide and evade that danger, but we might be listening, and it's hard to listen when we're breathing. So that could be a function, but you'll hear a lot of people say they pass out when they get scared. That's usually because their heart rate's up and they're not breathing. What about your stomach? What happens to your stomach when you're afraid?
Starts turning.
Butterflies. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Like you get those butterflies in your stomach.
Okay. When you're nervous, you might have that. That is like the starting sensation of somebody evacuating their stomach or stopping digestion, because that's not a necessary function, and in fact, it could slow us down. So we either want to expel or digest something a little quicker, so more acids are introduced when we're stressed. But for the most part, our gastrointestinal system does not work well when the sympathetic nervous system is activated. Okay, so you have all these things that happen within the body when it's activated. And the parasympathetic nervous system, and again, you're going to hear me reference this a lot throughout this course, because it's very much implicated in how we react, and especially in certain situations when emotions are flying or something is activating us, or we feel like we're in danger. So our parasympathetic nervous system is a purposeful response within our peripheral or autonomic nervous system to reduce that heart rate. Okay, so it will send ACH out to slow the heart down. Okay, it doesn't just come down on its own. It's not the absence of a sympathetic nervous system. It's the activation of a parasympathetic nervous system. So there's an actual signal that goes out to contract our pupils again, to slow our heart rate, to start stimulating digestion, to all these things, allow breathing to happen normally, to release our muscles from whatever tension we might be experiencing. Okay, so all these things happen simultaneously, and like I said, they happen pretty quickly, but not nearly as quickly as electricity as we know that. Okay, all right. Any questions? So I was hoping to get to the brain today. We won't. So what I'll probably do is just pick out some highlights on Monday of certain brain functions and areas of the brain that we're going to be most concerned with. So read up on that if you haven't already. You should have, because it's this week's lesson. But any questions or any comments regarding to the lesson? I'll ask some questions. I know a couple of you have emailed me or texted me and asked if you could stay behind, which is fine. But any questions about the lesson or comments?
Just to double check, do you post the recordings after every session?
I try to. So let me pause this here. Stop recording.